their date on their schedule for the day as opposed to 15. They get that. Then they start making changes because they're going to start to have to pay attention. As long as we keep feeding this monster, it will continue to put their hand out and ask for more. Juicing is one method. What you're choosing to eat is another. Maybe if you're a fast food lover and you're having your Dunkin' Donuts or whatever it is in the morning, maybe you should forego that. Instead of the bagel, something else, a smoothie. Things, small, subtle changes that you can make will make a huge difference. Bread is not your friend. It's a carbohydrate. It's raising your blood sugar. It's messing up your GI tract. And you wonder it's not a wonder because it's shown now that if your GI tract is inflamed, other mental health issues tend to take the forefront. Depression, anxiety are tied to gut health. Handling stress, not having enough sleep will mess with your ability to handle stress. And then all these indicators, these lifestyle, pushing your body to the limit leads to things like high blood pressure, high cholesterol, heart disease. It's just being aware and being conscious of taking care of yourself. Really, you have to love yourself. It doesn't just happen. And it's not from outside. It's from within. So until you make a choice to put boundaries on what you're going to do and what you're not going to accept, then this is the system that we're going to live in. I think that whole mindset pervades the entire society. If someone calls you a name that you're not, are you really going to get upset about it? They don't know you, right? If you have a good sense of self, you basically are very, very centered. Nothing that comes from outside in really can affect you because you actually know what your truth is. Sounds kind of earthy, crunchy, but honestly, it's really important because we have so many people trying to define us. They're trying to define us as doctors, as humans. AI is better than humans all of a sudden, and that's what we should give our power to. That's ridiculous. That's what makes us unique. That's what makes us special, is that we're not all the same, that we each have a gift, that we each have a contribution to make. Some of us haven't found it yet, unfortunately, but there's always hope. AI should not be the deciding factor on whether or not you get the chemotherapy based on your age or based on your sex or based on your race, because that's where it's going. And as long as we sit back and let it happen, then unfortunately I think we have no one to blame but ourselves. I refuse to live in a system like that. Hopefully my listeners have that switch turned on in them as well. But there's so much that you can do for yourself that you don't have to wait. I talk about it every time I'm on the show because it's really important. If you're not happy with your insurance plan, you have medical cost sharing. You've got Liberty Health Share, Samaritan, MediShare. You have direct primary care practices. Again, those are primary care and specialty practices that have a membership fee once a month, covers everything that's done in their office, or some of them have a yearly fee that covers all doctor services, but they have a way to send you out to specialists and testing centers that also are discounted. You have supplemental policies like AFLAC, which can be used with anything, whether you have Medicaid, Medicare, health insurance, standard, the commercial plans, or medical cost sharing. That adds another dimension to your ability to be free economically and from a health perspective. Liberty Health Share, because I could speak to it because I joined it, does not only lock you into staying in the United States for treatment. You can literally leave the country and go elsewhere for medical tourism, and Liberty Health Share will pay for it. Some insurance companies are doing that too. And if you think that you want to invest in that in the future, then if you want to stay with the commercial plans, ask them before you sign on if they have that as part of their policy. I understand people get insurance plans from their company. They don't have a lot of choice, but they can sign AFLAC plans. They can sign up for AFLAC plans. Anybody can do that. You don't have to be part of a company. You can be an individual and do it. So all of these things together are designed to give you choice, freedom of choice, not having to worry about the money as part of the thing that locks you into something. Let's say you have a job, you hate it, but you're sticking in there because of the insurance. Well, you don't have to. You can buy a Liberty Health Share plan, you can an Aflac plan, which I'm pretty sure would be cheaper than the insurance plan that you're paying for in your job right now. So it's about deciding that you're worthy and deciding this is not working for me for whatever reason, and I want to make a change. Knowledge is power. Sticking your head in the sand and hoping for the best is not the answer. Hoping for Congress to get their acts together to help you is not the answer. It's got to come from within. It's got to come from you doing your own due diligence. Don't listen to what I say. Do your own due diligence. Go on the internet and start searching. I'm giving you tools that you can do it. There's MedRetreat, which is an American company that helps you, that plug you in to foreign and even local or domestic locations for surgery, dental, cosmetic, cancer care, and they actually help for one fee. It pays for everything, and in their system, if there's a bad outcome, you can get it fixed for free. I mean, there's all sorts of, you get your money, like a money-back guarantee kind of thing, where if there is an issue, you're not going to pay double if there's something that needs to be corrected. These are things that actually exist now. Go and find them so that when you do enter the system, you know exactly what your rights are, what your choices are, and you can control the outcome as much as possible. That's pretty much all I have to say. I mean, go on my website, drelainageorge.com. There's links to everything I talk about. You're certainly welcome to contact me through my website. And I hope everybody has a wonderful week. Signing off. Thank you for listening to Medicine on Call. And take care of yourself.
Do you have a problem with the feeling of something stuck in your throat, throat tightness, bad breath, a chronic cough, or frequent throat clearing? Maybe you have acid reflux, which is a common problem. Or maybe you have persistent ear pain, ear clogging, or ringing in the ears, but have been told you don't have ear infections. Perhaps it's because you grind your teeth at night. Sometimes the symptoms don't seem to be connected to an underlying problem. Sometimes the answer to a nagging symptom that doesn't go away or respond to treatments can be found by having your doctor give you the time to explain exactly what's going on in order to discover the root of the problem. This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. I believe in taking the time to perform a thorough examination, discuss the findings, and answer your questions, because I believe that our patients are empowered when they're given all the treatment options. It's simple. When you understand the problem, you get to decide which treatment option works best for you. It's all about the power of choice, because Peachtree ENT Center is where patient care counts. For more information or to make an appointment, go to www.peachtreeentcenter.com. That's peachtreeentcenter.com. peachtreeentcenter.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Cook Immigration Partners is your passport through the immigration maze. Whether it's help with E-Verify in your business, or help in how to document a new employee under the new I-9 rules, or if you marry a foreign national, Cook Immigration Partners is your best choice for a legal advocate. Call us today at 866-286-6200. That's 866-286-6200, or visit us on the web at www.immigration.net.
This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. Healthcare reform is confusing, but one thing has become obvious. Whether it's finding an affordable insurance plan, keeping your doctor, or being able to afford needed prescriptions, navigating the healthcare system has become a challenge. With the loss of the Obamacare mandate, those needing help can now choose an affordable alternative. By joining Liberty Health Share, you will become part of a community of health-conscious Americans all over the country who want to control their own healthcare costs and choices. Liberty Health Share is not insurance. It's an association of self-pay patients who unite with like-minded people to share their medical needs. Neighbor helping neighbor. Medical, surgical, and some alternative holistic treatments are covered without restrictive doctor and hospital panels. Plans start as low as $107 a month for an individual and $345 a month for a family. Healthcare without the hassle. What a simple concept. Learn more now by going to libertyoncall.org or call 1-800-714-6993.
This is Lawyer Liz. Join me each week as we discuss drones, the Internet of Things, and all the technology in between. It's Buzz Off with Lawyer Liz, Wednesdays at 2.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
And I guess I'll see you later this afternoon.
Thank you, Kurt.
Take care.
Thanks, Kurt.
Vogside Publishing for over 38
on America's Web Radio. I'm your host, Lawyer Liz, and while I am an attorney, the Buzz Off Show is not legal advice. Instead, it's a weekly look at all the technology buzz surrounding drones, autonomous vehicles, the Internet of Things, and all the gadgets and gizmos in between. Catch us each Wednesday on America's Web Radio from 2 to 3 in the afternoon Eastern, or find the Lawyer Liz podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, your favorite podcast streaming service. And we've recently been digging deep into technology policy and what's been going on at the federal level with Congress, as well as a deeper dive with some of the issues that the state of Georgia has been tackling with SB 315, which is still sitting on the governor's desk, hopefully soon to be vetoed. But we're going to wind up and wrap up that technology policy discussion and be joined a little bit later in the show by a legal expert with a technology problem, or a technology expert with a legal problem. But Kathy Gellis will be joining us again to really look back at what's been going on at the federal level, the impact of SESTA and FOSTA that have passed now, and really what are the repercussions and where do we go from here. But before we welcome Kathy to the show, we're going to take a look at all the news that's been going on, from Facebook to Twitter to all kinds of Amazon action. It's been a busy go of it lately, and in particular, it seems that Facebook, from Mark Zuckerberg's testimony before the Senate and the House to F8, the Facebook conference, where a lot of news coming out, including what Facebook's doing with your data and dating. Apparently, Facebook is giving all the dating apps a run for their money, and quite frankly, being honest with some of the functions that people have already figured out on their own. They're going to add a dating element to the site, and simply news of that addition apparently sent Match.com's stock tumbling. So be curious to see how that happens in the midst of everything else, because that's exactly what Facebook needs, is our dating conversations even called out like that, or we're going to go ahead and do the filtering for them by using their dating element. But not only that, Facebook will be adding, according to Zuckerberg, a new feature called Clear History, and essentially allowing you to do what you've already been able to do on various websites, where you can go through and clear your cookies and history of what you've been interacting with on Facebook. Again, perhaps not enough to change the tide and backlash, or who knows, but we will soon see. And it's not just data or Facebook coming under fire for selling data, as we've even talked about on the show before. common practice. Apps will, that's part of the old adage, if you're not paying for the service, then you are the product. But one of the things that Twitter recently disclosed was that they, in 2015, actually beginning in 2014, for a 5-month period from December 2014 to April 2015, they gave the same famous researcher linked to Cambridge Analytica, Alexander Kogan, gave him access, or he purchased essentially public Twitter information, but for that 5-month period, he received a sample of tweets, no private data, essentially rather than what you or I could do by going through and pulling off public and scraping that public information. Just provided him a more filtered aspect of it. He says it wasn't sold to Cambridge Analytica, but what will become of that is more, I have a feeling he's not going to be, or Twitter's not going to be the last one to have to make these disclosures. But even getting into disclosures and chit-chatting, Amazon has released an Echo Dot for kids with the Alexa feature. Colorful, but needed? Maybe not. Music, it will answer questions, including stock answers to is Santa real, in which Alexa will confirm that she has never met him, but also included will be a 1-year subscription to Free Time Unlimited, which is Amazon's reading and music service geared towards children ages 5 to 12. So, and of course, parents will have controls over what content, what language, perhaps what music, but when reports continue to come out that children are coming into kindergarten unable to grip or control the pen or pencil, that their writing skills and coloring skills are falling behind, do they really need one more way to connect to the internet and kind of stifle, but also get exposed to potentially different harmful content that in some cases may or may not truly be age appropriate? Well, not only is Amazon getting into the children's nursery, Amazon is now delivering packages to the trunk of your car, rolling out a test in 37 cities. You must be a Prime member. And oh, by the way, Amazon Prime membership costs, monthly membership costs, are about to increase. But if you have the Amazon Key app and a 2015 or newer vehicle from a list of participating vehicles, not all manufacturers are on the list, then yes, Amazon Prime will deliver packages to the trunk of your car. So if anything like me, admittedly, the trunk of my car is not clean. If it wasn't a convertible, it would be completely full. But instead, I have to leave a little bit of room for the convertible top. But you get the idea. You're going to have, not only will folks come deliver the packages to your house, and you got to now keep the entryway clean and free of clutter and worry about that. Now you need to worry about your trunk. So it will be interesting to see how that service plays out and whether it is picked up as heavily as apparently Amazon is hoping. Well, not only are folks going to be coming into your car, but your car is going to be driving itself. Waymo and Honda are teaming up and have announced with scant details, but they're going to be partnering for autonomous delivery, as well as Honda confirming that all of its car platforms going forward will have autonomous capabilities. Not only that, but in spite of, or perhaps despite the recent Tesla and Uber crashes and news. Several states and cities are still moving forward with their autonomous shuttles and plans, including the city of Atlanta, but also a neighbor to north of Atlanta has announced plans to open an autonomous driving track, a course to test vehicles that's planned to be up in Peachtree Corners, Gwinnett County, Georgia, but will be opening in 2019. So curious to see how that goes. But not only are cars getting into the connected market, but Lumos Bike Helmet has announced that they're going to sync with Apple Watch, where essentially your watch gestures will signal and cause turn signals and other lights displayed on the back of the helmet. So a gesture to the left would indicate you're turning to left, etc. And in an era where distracted driving is always an issue, having one more way for a biker to signal, perhaps not a bad idea. Well, when it comes to signaling and letting folks know what's going on, Fitbit and Google have announced a partnership where Google will send the Fitbit health data streaming in real time to your doctor. So if the doctor's looking for certain information, be it tracking medical conditions, etc., no more fudging that you were at the gym and instead were sitting on the couch binge watching your favorite show. And your doctor's going to know, and not only that, know in real time. The question then becomes, if the hackers weren't already paying attention, well, now they get another opportunity to do so with your Fitbit. But when it comes to paying attention, one last little tidbit before we jump to our conversation and welcome Kathy to the show. But while, granted, it led to the Golden State Killer being identified, arrested. I mean, the man allegedly killed 12 people, raped 45 women. But what's interesting about that is how police found him. A DNA website that they had a DNA sample from one of the crime scenes years ago that didn't match anything in their registry. Well, a relative, so not the killer himself, but a relative had used the free service GED match, and the police ran their DNA sample through that. So one of the questions is privacy, but if the end result is catching a killer, it becomes a very difficult public policy debate. How much is Big Brother watching? Well, the good news is, unless you live in China, then at least Big Brother hasn't quite given you a score yet, which is what they've done. And China's announced where they're going to be giving different citizens. Truly, if you are a fan of Person of Interest, the machine has gone live and is judging always. Well, right after this commercial break, we'll welcome Kathy to the show. You're listening to Buzz Off with Lawyer Liz on America's Web Radio.
Cook Immigration Partners is your passport through the immigration maze. Whether it's help with E-Verify in your business, or help in how to document a new employee under the new I-9 rules, or if you marry a foreign national, Cook Immigration Partners is your best choice for a legal advocate. Call us today at 866-286-6200. That's 866-286-6200, or visit us on the web at www.immigration.net.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
This is Dr. George from Peachtree ENT Center. We've won patient care awards and have the highest patient recommendations because we believe in practicing medicine the old-fashioned way. Practicing good medicine is based in listening to the patient and making a care plan that is individual. The best medical care is given when there is a strong doctor-patient relationship built on mutual trust and respect. At Peachtree ENT Center, we believe in taking care of the whole patient because healing is more than writing a prescription. Whether you have problems hearing, have frequent throat or sinus infections, from the time you call our office and speak to a real person, you'll be treated as an individual and not as an ailment. During your visit, you will not be rushed, and all your questions will be answered. When possible, natural treatments will be recommended to fix the problem. If surgery is recommended, cost-effective, minimally invasive treatment for snoring, sleep apnea, or sinus problems will be offered, because Peachtree ENT Center is where patient care counts.
The disease of addiction is a life-altering challenge, not just for the person suffering its effects, but also for the family and friends who support and love the one caught in its grasp. What should be the course of treatment? Who is the best person to render treatment? And what is the best place to go for the care that is needed? We know that you want answers to these and many more questions. Call 770-696-9862 and speak to a representative of the Atlanta Healing Center. They can tailor a program specifically designed to address the needs of the person suffering with an addiction, or give you guidance as to where that help may be found. Information is the key, and the trained staff at AHC is here to assist. If you wish, you can also get more information on the website located at www.atlantahealingcenter.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
And welcome back to Buzz Off with Lawyer Liz on America's Web Radio. As we teased before the break, we're bringing back our technology and privacy expert with a law and attorney problem, Kathy Gellis. Kathy, welcome back. Is that an accurate description? You're a tech nerd with a legal problem?
Yes. I mean, I wouldn't call it a problem. I'd call it I can fix things, right? Because I understand how they work, right? So I'd call it my superhero strength.
I like it. You speak both geek and legal, you know. It is a rare combination and part of the Justice League. Except I wouldn't say Avengers.
It's too bad they've taken away the phone booths because I've got some interesting costume changes.
Oh, now that, folks, we will definitely pick up on a future show. And I was going to say, I don't want to give spoiler alerts for the latest Avengers, so we won't even pretend to go into the Marvel world. Perhaps we'll just stay in the DC Comics world. But all of that to say, last we left off, our intrepid hero was fighting and railing against the evils of essentially the SESTA and was it FOSTA?
There were companion bills. The one in the Senate that had been brewing for a while was called SESTA. There was an alternate version brewing in the House called FOSTA, and then they percolated together and formed a super duper monster bill, and it's a little unclear exactly which one passed. I think technically FOSTA, because it came out of the House, was the bill that ended up becoming law, but some people still refer to this whole outcry as SESTA because that had been the primary bill language that led to this whole mess.
So with any good supervillain, and I think it just goes without saying that eventually two lesser villains will join forces to create that massive overall super evil. But
it's the worst Voltron ever.
Well,
it's an evil Voltron. They came together and they formed a creature that is doing a ton of harm to things that are really important, like free speech on the internet.
Well, it sounds like Thanos found all of his Infinity Stones to switch universes, but when it gets down to it, though, all is not lost. Is there still hope? And what do these evil? I mean, what have we seen come out of this so far? And perhaps even a little background to remind us, meanwhile, on Earth, what's been going on?
So one of the things that, to back up a little bit, is there's this law that we've referred to as Section 230. And Section 230 gives the internet platforms that intermediate the things you say on the internet protection from the stupid, illegal things that people may use their platforms to say. And that sounds like, why should they get off the hook? But if you think about, for instance, how many tweets people tweet, there's an awful lot of dumb, stupid, potentially illegal things that people using Twitter may say. And if Twitter could be liable for all of them, or even some large subset of them, that would be problematic. Twitter couldn't exist. It would just be way too expensive to even take on the fight, even if they were able to say, no, it wasn't illegal after all. So one of the laws that we've had, and we've had it for over 20 years, is Section 230, which basically says whatever stupid illegal thing gets said on the internet, you can go after who said it for the stupid illegality of it, but you can't go after the service that intermediated it. And that's really important to give them the protection so that we can get cool services out there to intermediate our speech. So the problem...
So, I was going to say, in addition to Twitter, other platforms, I mean, Facebook, we have Craigslist, and I mean, what are some of the big ones that people may not realize?
Well, so Twitter, I usually do the example with something like Twitter because people can perceive what that is, that you are saying something and you need Twitter to make sure that other people can read what you've just said. But a lot of services are platforms. So we've got big ones that are obviously doing sort of the social media platforms. So we've got Google. We've got Twitter. We've got Facebook. But we do also have Google. Google is in some ways an obvious platform that intermediates speech. It also intermediates speech in ways that people don't perceive. When it's doing a search engine function, it is also intermediating speech because somebody has posted something somewhere on the internet and Google is returning clips of what they said and links to what they said to other people who want to be connected with that information. So that's an intermediating function. Online e-commerce sites are performing an intermediating function. If you buy something from eBay is intermediating the seller saying, hi, I have something to sell, and the buyer saying, yes, I would like to buy it. And then that's some of the big examples, but this intermediation happens at so many different levels of the internet. It happens with your email providers. It happens with your ISPs giving you access to the internet at all. And then it can also happen on a much smaller scale with individual speech. One of the examples I go back to is if you, for instance, retweet a tweet, you are performing an intermediating function. You are taking something that somebody else said and you are intermediating it so other people can see it. If you have a post on Facebook and your post takes comments and somebody comes and comments on your post, you are performing an intermediating function for whoever just commented on your post. So people tend to get very preoccupied with how dare Twitter, how dare Facebook, how dare, and we talked about this last time, the company called Backpage, how dare they intermediate this speech? It's bad, it's wrongful, it's wrong, it's stupid. But the answer is the reason we have this very expansive law is because there's intermediating functions happening all over the place for basically every single piece of communication happening on the internet. And if we didn't have this protection, it could grind to a halt, and that would be bad.
So you've got the speech, you've got all of these platforms that are really just trying to be a pass-through kind of content platform, and the evil conglomerate of bills that have crashed together. Now they've passed, and the end result, what's happened? I mean, everyone rattled their sabers, pointed out
we're seeing censorship.
We're trying to regulate this content.
Censorship.
What are we seeing now?
We're seeing it at a couple levels. One is, and this is a very visible example, that platforms are SESTA and FOSTA, or whichever, the monster bill that came out from that, did a lot of damage to that really important immunity that Section 230 provided. It didn't completely kill it. It left most of the statutory language there, but it ended up cutting a really big hole in Section 230 itself, and then in some parallel laws that also got passed as part of this bill. And the effect of that parallel, of all this language that got changed, is Section 230 has gone from a sure thing that a platform can rely on to a very questionable thing. As a lawyer, as an advocate, I'm not going to concede that Section 230 doesn't provide protection to an awful lot of intermediating behavior, but also as a lawyer who counsels clients, I look at that language and sometimes my advice seems to be run screaming, because I can see all the risk of it creates so many holes where a private litigant, the federal government, or even some state attorney generals can come after the platform if they think that the content you've intermediated offends those other statutes in some way, and they're so broad that they can catch an awful lot of information. So one of the things about SESTA FOSTA is that it was designed to quell any online content that related to sex trafficking, but the effect is that it's chilled any sort of, it has most certainly chilled any sort of adult content, including legitimate protected adult content, but it's also chilled a lot of not necessarily too adult content. So for instance, Craigslist took down its entire personal section because there's something where it's adult in the sense of grown-ups date, but it wasn't necessarily adult in anything more scandalous than that, but grown-ups date, and they're going to maybe exchange, be provocative in terms of how they might try to attract each other in their ads. And Craigslist is like, we can't be in the business of moderating that, protecting it, or being on the hook if one of these posts happens to offend some state attorney general somewhere. So they took down the entire section, and Craigslist Personals is no more. It's a dramatic move, but it isn't an irrational move. There are a lot of other platforms, particularly those that have more grown-up type content, who are very, very worried about how they can continue to have any of that content. But realistically, the way the statute gets read, it has some pretty broad reach. And so even platforms that are not necessarily subject specific and have all sorts of content, that it's a scary time for them. It is not as clear that Section 230 is giving them the backup that they had been relying on for the previous 20 some odd years.
Well, and it even has come into play with some of the recent headlines in Congress or congressional hearings with Facebook, and asking Zuckerberg if Facebook and all, like, if Section 230 provides protection.
It doesn't require that content be neutral. But I think there's a couple of things going on here. One is that people are really mad at Facebook. And so some of the optics is, hang on a second, Facebook likes this law? Well, if Facebook likes that law, let's get rid of it because we really want to hurt them right now. So if Facebook likes 230, let's get rid of Section 230. So I think there's a certain recklessness among regulators right now because there's so much antipathy towards Facebook. And that's unfortunate because Facebook should like Section 230, but it is not just Facebook that likes it or depends on it for business critical or in any way other form of critical communication ability. You did ask about harm, and some of the other harm is that there are a number of people who let's be frank, some sex workers, they're out there. You may not like it, you may not like that prostitution exists, etc., but it happens. And basically one of the things that can happen is either it happens on the streets where women are extremely vulnerable to being exploited by middlemen or killed by Johns or something like that, versus having internet platforms available to them has given them a level of safety because it's given them a sense of agency over the work they take, the terms that they take it on, who they take it with. They get to sort of filter it. There is essentially already a body count where when you take away the ability to for these sex workers to be able to use the internet, it drives them to the street, and there's already homicides that have resulted from platforms not being available to them anymore. There's also some data that when Craigslist took down its adult section years ago, because they used to have a far more adult area available, it upped the entire homicide rate for women in general. So you asked what has happened. The answer is censorship, but actually that pulls the punch a little bit. The answer has been homicide. That covers some of that answer. Getting back to the neutrality issues, there's some interesting stuff to talk about there, but I think People get confused about the optics. Nobody wants vulnerable people to get injured, but that prompted the SESTA-FOSTA to pass in the first place, even though a lot of people were saying it's going to blow up. It's not going to have the effect of protecting people. It's going to make these vulnerable people more vulnerable, and it's had that effect.
Yeah, well, and one of the things we will have to pick all that back up right after this commercial break.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
45 years of experience is behind the most trusted name in auto transportation. Passport Transport, the first and finest today. That's why Passport Transport is the preferred auto transport for major auto manufacturers, concours, museums, tours, and collectors, and should be your choice from across the state to across the country. When you have the need, go to PassportTransport.com and enjoy the peace of mind referenced experience will give you. Passport Transport.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to Buzz Off with Lawyer Liz on America's Web Radio. Catch us each Wednesday from 2 to 3 Eastern on americaswebradio.com or the Lawyer Liz podcast on iTunes, Google Play, and your favorite podcast streaming services. Talking today, I guess we can call this someone almost Sex Lies and Congress, or
Sex Lies and Red Tape.
Yes, Sex Lies and Red Tape. I love it. But chatting with legal expert and privacy and technology guru Kathy Gellis on what is going on in Congress when we start looking at Section 230, the protections it provided, and legislation. I mean, is this a trilogy, do you think, Kathy, where it's kind of it's always darkest before the dawn, if we're going to go back to our comic book references, where, okay, SESTA and FOSTA, the conglomerate, dual bill passed, and some of these sites are reacting. We turn on the news and Mark Zuckerberg's testimony before Congress, both the House and the Senate, certainly took on a life of its own, including memes, poor guy, showing him sitting on a booster seat. When you get into all of that, what's going on? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel, so to speak, or is there more to come?
As an inherent optimist, I'm going to hope there's a light at the end of the tunnel, but the question is, how much pain and damage do we have to endure before we get to it? And I'm worried because, even SESTA-FOSTA, there are some people who, behind it, where I said that it was largely a bill motivated to protect sex workers. I think there are some people who genuinely thought that. There were probably some other people who totally knew that it would basically function as a prohibition against prostitution. They don't like prostitution, and if it was happening via the internet, let's figure out how to make it not happen through the internet, because in theory, I suppose it's supposed to mean it doesn't happen at all. I don't think that's a safe assumption, but that may have been what motivated some people. But otherwise, you had people who genuinely wanted to protect sex workers, but annoyed all the evidence that people were trying to provide to say it's not going to have that effect, and now it's causing damage. So the question is, I'm not sure. There's some little bit of me that is slightly optimistic that because it has caused damage that I think some well-meaning people hadn't expected, that could potentially create the political factors where maybe the worst of it could be undone. But that doesn't usually happen. Usually these laws go on the books and then they stay on the books and they stay on the books in their terrible way for ages. There are some possibilities that it may be challenged. There are a couple aspects to SESTA-FOSTA, whichever version you want to label it, that make it vulnerable to challenge. But some of them you can knock out little bits of unconstitutional bits and still be left with the rest. For instance, one unconstitutional bit is that it isn't just what a site intermediates as of now that could potentially be published, but it creates potentially liability for anything it had published in the past. And that starts to look, I believe the term is ex post facto. The Constitution says you can't make up a law to go back and punish something that already happened. You had to already have the law on the books for there to have been liability. So that little part is very ripe for challenge, and somebody may challenge it. I think the more interesting question is, whether it could be challenged on a First Amendment basis. About this has obviously had a real chilling effect on speech, and usually when you affect speech, particularly on a content basis, you have to have a very narrowly tailored solution that can survive strict scrutiny, and I don't think this can. The fact that it has wiped out so much perfectly legitimate, lawful content, I think impugns this regulation as being constitutional on its face. And then there's a couple of other issues that people are kicking around, but the logistics of challenging a bill is tricky. Like, you need the right plaintiff. Ideally, you need the right plaintiff that the optics are good, because especially for the sites that were intermediating some of the more adult content, not everybody is a fan of that. And even though it may be perfectly lawful under the First Amendment, judges and juries can be tempted not to see it in terms of its lawful principle. They can just be tempted to see it as, ugh, I don't like it, therefore it should go away. So the logistics of challenging a lawsuit are also difficult. But there's also the potential harm. I mean, I think there's a body count, and I don't mean to be flippant around it, but there are definitely measurable consequences to the physical safety of a number of women as a result of this law. There is a growing list of websites that have taken down content, taken down either entire sections of content or spot censored other content. And that list is going to grow, and that list might ultimately impress somebody that there's a political need to do something. And there's also going to be an economic effect where I think Congress, and this gets back to your Facebook point, kill Facebook, kill Facebook, kill Facebook. What happens if you do? Consider how many people these companies employ, the enormous contribution they have to the economic engine of the company, of the country. At a certain point, they're going to kill this entire industry. And I don't think that's exaggerating. I mean, some of the larger companies will be able to pivot and endure, but then instead of having an open internet where we have the ability for anybody to all of a sudden go from garage to billionaire via IPO to we got what we got, and that's who we're stuck with, because they're the only people who can capitalize themselves through all the regulatory morass that has now been inflicted on them.
Well, when you start, as you noted, when you have a body count, an economic body count, a literal body count, but when you can kind of have all of these things coming together, usually you can see some legislative change, that people will dial it back. If it's not there, it's the courts. But doesn't some of these concerns, the misconstrued intentions or misdirected intentions, or legitimate, I have a political agenda, I'm going to push it, some of that gets reflected in the broader tech policy approaches. I mean, when you go and look at Senator Cruz's line of questioning to Mark during the Facebook hearings, where, getting back to that content neutral, that to enjoy the protections of Section 230, Senator Cruz was essentially saying that the Facebook had to be content neutral in order to be protected, which just isn't accurate. So how do you bridge some of that gap and have those conversations or get the word out that this is not the case, that you don't understand the basic either technology, the platform? I mean, it seems to me that's probably the greatest challenge you face as one who's fighting these battles in the court.
Yeah, I mean, it's always problematic when Congress regulates or attempts to regulate something it doesn't understand. It's never going to be good if you try to regulate something you don't understand. I don't know if you've heard of the law of fences. This was something that it's not original to John F. Kennedy, but he quoted it. That basically, in paraphrase, if you come across a field and you see a fence, don't take down the fence until you know why it's there, because you might not see the lion in the weeds waiting to pounce on you. But if you take down the fence and the lion gets to sneak up on you, that, know why we've done things before you start messing them up. And Congress did not understand, and they tore down the fence that was Section 230. So that's always ill-advised. And one of the things that the Facebook hearings revealed is how selective the clued-inness was among Congress, that the number of people who really understood the issues that they were asking questions about was appallingly small. So there are certain efforts for, well, what can you do structurally to better inform Congress? And one of the things that's getting proposed, and I'm going to have to fudge what I think it's being called, but there used to be something called like the Office of Technological Assessment. I'm mushing that, but there used to be an Office of Technology Experts that was built into Congress to advise Congress so that they could have some built-in expertise. And there are proposals to bring that back, and that would be an excellent idea. Politically, Silicon Valley's been somewhat criticized for being really slow to be in D.C., that on certain other policy issues, other incumbent businesses had boots on the ground and good infrastructure to be able to speak in the way that special interests like to speak to Congress, and they were able to sort of co-opt policy much more effectively because Silicon Valley wasn't there. And some of it wasn't there because they were smaller companies, they were less capitalized, and they live in California where DC is very far away, and it didn't really dawn on these companies that a business critical function was going to be having FaceTime in DC to make sure that the regulation that affected them was not going to go off the rails. So there's increasing efforts by the tech industry to push for the policy it desperately needs to survive. And otherwise, I think, some of this is, can we inform the citizenry a little bit better? Like I said before, people are scared. They don't really understand what's happening, but it feels bad. And so therefore people are like looking to, authority figures to go deal with things that are happening that are bad and just trusting them to do it right. And I think we need to help inform normal people what is at stake with various regulatory questions so that they can lobby their own congresspeople to vote in ways that are healthier to preserving the things that are actually important to them, and they wouldn't purposely be asking to have taken away from them, like free speech on the internet.
Well, one of the things, too, is you've seen, we've had different technology experts come in and offer guidance, as you noted, and kind of filling in that understanding what roles people are playing. I mean, I saw a comment online saying, well, if only we had the subject matter experts question the other subject matter experts rather than the members of Congress themselves doing the questioning. And I thought, well, you've got to have one voice, and haven't they just prepped better? But that does bear in mind, or bear the question, how do you provide that expertise?
Well, they did have some, even in SESTA, even in the FOSTA hearings, for instance, they had law professors testifying. What was sort of especially unfortunate about this process is I think legislation tends to be better when it follows extensive hearings where they can create a record and have a record that is going to be evidence-based for whatever policy results. And they were on their way to doing that. In fact, some of the pushback, I think, by Professor Eric Goldman, there's a knowledge standard floating around in SESTA, in FOSTA. It was in SESTA, it wasn't in FOSTA, but then eventually it ended up in FOSTA. There's this knowledge requirement, which is one of the things that makes the change so dangerous for platforms. Without getting into the weeds of that, there's this knowledge thing. It's a problem. And he had pointed this out in the hearings, that there's this knowledge thing and it's in the language and it's a problem. And they actually took him seriously. And so in one of the drafts of a red line of the bill, it came out based on this feedback.
Well, I was going to say, so we're going to have to tease this, jump to a commercial break, and then find out what happens when your joke becomes reality.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
And welcome back to Buzz Off with Lawyer Liz on America's Web Radio. I'm your host, Lawyer Liz, chatting today on the 6 lies and red tape that results from, let's just say, not necessarily shoddy, but perhaps good-intended, good-natured, but when regulators try to regulate platforms, they can often miss the mark. And so we're chatting today with legal expert Kathy Kellis. And Kathy, you were teasing us right before the break. What happens when my notes in jest actually make it into the legislation or the policy decisions?
Well, so I started to tell you about, so Professor Goldman pushed back on this onerous aspect of FOSTA, and it came out, and then that expression about never watch how laws and sausage get made. The sausage got made, and somehow it ended up back in it, and we ended up with the FOSTA-SESTA monster bill that had the worst of everything, and it came together to be the bill that went into law. So I want to say there was a happy ending because, we followed best practices for how to, create regulation in a sensible, prudent manner, but unfortunately that isn't quite what actually happened there. But in terms of a recommendation, having the right experts, having the hearings, have as many hearings as you need, get all the people, get all the stakeholders, and create a record, because, it also looked good in litigation if Congress has to defend this in some point where, if it's subject to challenge, that it shows that, again, strict scrutiny, they had to kind of know what they were doing, and they don't look like they knew what they were doing. And, that will actually potentially make a challenge easier, because they can't say that this was a carefully tailored solution to a regulatory challenge, since there's a lot of evidence to say they weren't careful at all.
Well, it makes me think of Ghostbusters, where, they're told, think of the form of the enforcer, or the god. And of course, next thing we know, Stay Puft Marshmallow Man is destroying New York City. And it was like, well, I tried to think of the most, happy, innocuous, like the harmless thing I could. And yet it still manages to tear apart the city until our intrepid Ghostbusters fight back. So perhaps an apt analogy, or perhaps I've just been watching too many 80s flicks.
I already cited Ultron in this conversation, so I think we're thematically relevant here.
Yeah. I like it. So where is some of this coming? I mean, it seems that a lot of this, we talk about it being good-natured or good-intended. I mean, who doesn't want to end sex trafficking? The fact that it also stripped down legitimate or perhaps less lascivious or other things, and it had the unintended consequences. I mean, when you look at kind of even the Facebook hearings, where Facebook is evil, it's doing all these things, it's selling all this data, but that really wasn't new, or it shouldn't have been as much of a surprise as apparently it is and it was. How do you see that changing, or how do you see that changing?
I want to believe that, with information, fear is defeated by information. If we can get information to people, that will help. But that's a really big underpinning to some of the regulatory challenges that we're having right now. But it isn't the the be-all, end-all. There are also people, there's also self-interest, and there's different conflicting interests that also use regulatory challenges as opportunities to advance their own private interests, and even if they're not necessarily the best ones across the board. And it's possible to convince people that that is what they want. The reality with SESTA FOSTA, so, okay, you said, well, who doesn't want to help? I think the question of who doesn't want to help sex trafficking victims is one where you could say, of course, everybody wants to help them. But in terms of let's measure the harm that's resulted from this bill, then I think things get a little unclear. There's been a tremendous amount of censorship harm to general speech interests. That should be something everybody cares about, but if you called up a lot of people and said, you know, it depends how you frame it. Do you care that you have free speech online? Not everybody is necessarily a fan. Maybe they should be, but maybe they just don't realize how it really matters to their lives. They're kind of like, you know, people keep saying things I don't like, so let's censor them. That sounds good. Even in America, people, you know, flag-waving people aren't always a fan of all the constitutional tenets that inform our democracy, because they are often used to protect the unpopular, and people tend to vote for what is popular. So there's also conflicts there, because then if you go back and you look at the other form of harm that's come from SESTA FOSTA is it has hurt sex workers directly, physically, and I think there are some people who, not that they want to see them hurt, but if you said that the policy challenge is to make sure that they can have them and they can conduct the work they're going to do in a safe way, there's a lot of people who would say, forget that, I don't want it to exist at all, and I don't want to support anything that would potentially help this activity that I think should be completely illegal and not happen. So these can be really complicated regulatory challenges. That's SESTA FOSTA. But you can extend that logic to any other challenge where you look at Facebook. People are upset with what happened with Facebook and Cambridge Analytica largely because of what the effect appeared to be on things they cared about. That is driving a lot of political interest in doing whatever would stop it, even though maybe similar things had happened previously where other presidential campaigns might have shared data and acquired it from social media or used social media effectively. And if that was the guy you were rooting for, then maybe the optics don't look like this is a problem that we need to fix. So these are complicated questions in terms of, you know, as people don't really know exactly how much these principles may matter to their lives, then you end up playing sort of a lot of political favoritism, and it's difficult to get a coherent policy conversation from people who care but don't entirely know why they should care or what they should care about. So, I mean, on my to-do list, and that's why I do podcasts, is, you know, to help teach people and explain to people and say that, yeah, what we're talking about may help speech you don't like. It may help a person you don't like. It might help a politician you don't like. But that a lot of these principles are principles that are on the books and exist because someday they're going to be what you need to. And I think that's an important message to convey to people, and then explain both in terms of the technology and in terms of the regulation what that means and how that should guide our choices.
And it seems too that you have and it seems too that you have to kind of, as you said, put aside the fear. Just because you don't like the outcome perhaps doesn't mean that the platform is wrong. And one of the other ways it seems we've seen state and local governments jump in the mix is when you start looking at some of the other disruptive platforms saying, well, we don't like the outcome, and that these are platforms that are permitting, for example, Airbnb to increase traffic in our area because there's more tourists coming in, more vacationers, or we're not getting the same hotel motel tax revenue that perhaps we would receive if they were going through a more formal process, or even Uber and Lyft and some of these other disruptive platforms, but not understanding the platform or not understanding the harm or just going straight after that.
Yeah, there's a lot of levels of things that are going on. I mean, with Airbnb, one of the challenges is that local jurisdictions are varying in their enthusiasm for how much they like these services. Some of the places, like out here in the San Francisco Bay Area, where the housing market is ridiculously tight, they sort of look at Airbnb and the short-term rentals as being something that is making it potentially tighter. There's some question of whether this is true. There are some upsides to having these services, which is, to some respect, people can only afford their rent if they can do short-term rentals when they're on vacation, because it makes up the difference. Meanwhile, other jurisdictions entirely are fans of it. There's certain communities who are like, this is helping us have a tourist industry at all because we don't have hotels, and this is great, and everybody makes some money, and we can handle this overflow demand. The problem when you start having local jurisdictions attempt to target the platforms for their speech intermediating behavior, hey, I have an apartment to rent, would you like one? That's speech intermediating. The problem when local jurisdictions get to go after it is they're putting pressure on the platform, and if they're able to put the pressure on the platform, they'll force the platform to either not exist or change the shape of its services in a way that might appeal to that jurisdiction, but it's now decided it for everybody. And so one of the things that's built into Section 230, and this hasn't changed with it hasn't exactly changed with SESTA FOSTA, is a preemption clause that basically says you can't do anything high local jurisdiction. You can't do something that changes the protection the platform would have happened we basically want to defer to federal policy, because this is something where there are just way too many jurisdictions that would have way too many sets of rules, and it would cripple a platform if they had to figure out how to comply with all of them. So that's why we have some preemption to say, no, we're going to turn to Congress. This is interstate commerce. Let Congress figure out what the appropriate policy would be. That's part of the answer to what you were saying. And that's an important point. The internet crosses borders, and that's a reality of the technology, and it's something. This is hard. We have never lived in a world where billions of people could immediately talk to each other. That is a very challenging moment for the human race to figure out how to handle. We are figuring it out. There are some growing pains. We can get through the growing pains, because while on the one hand it's somewhat terrifying, this is also one of the most exciting moments in human history that all of a sudden this is available. And I think we want to be careful that we regulate in a way that lets us have all the promise of this new technology, minimize the downsides, but by all means, don't minimize the upsides too. And I think that's the thing we have to be really careful as we start to make our policy choices, that we, just because it lays a normal egg every so often doesn't mean we should kill the golden goose.
So what can people do to stay engaged and track these issues?
So what can people do?
General media literacy and keeping up with the news, and some sources are more authoritative than others. I, for instance, write at a tech news site called TechDirt, TechDirt.com. Ars Technica is very good. The EFF is an organization that tracks these issues and does advocacy around them. It's worth subscribing to their newsletter, checking out their Twitter feed, following their blog, because they have their ear on the ground keeping track of these things. It's also worth, general technology literacy yourself is also important. Some of these machines are increasingly mysterious, and, not being afraid to really understand how to drive the devices in your life, that's a good thing to do. And it's daunting. I know that everybody sort of reaches a fatigue point, but that's also something to drive through, because it also means that you actually have some experience. And again, that can help inform, the policy choices that you would like to make.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for sharing your time and insights. And so I encourage everyone to follow Kathy on Twitter.
Well, thank you, Kathy, for sharing your time and insights. And so I encourage everyone to follow Kathy on Twitter and her writings as well. And fortunately, apologies to Rob Graham. We ran out of time for him to share his insights on entertainment and politics. But thank you to America's Web Radio. I'm your host, Lawyer Liz. Catch us next time on Buzz Off with Lawyer Liz on America's Web Radio.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Good morning. Welcome to Medicine on Call.
And we do welcome you to Medicine on Call with Dr. Elena George. She's stuck in traffic, but we have a very special guest on her. She does. State Representative South Carolina State Representative Tom Davis is going to be calling in a few minutes, and we'll put him on. Right now, we're going to take just a couple of breaks as Dr. George is on her way, flying over 400 or weaving in and out as fast as she can. We'll be back right after this. Thank you.
Do you have a problem with the feeling of something stuck in your throat, throat tightness, bad breath, a chronic cough, or frequent throat clearing? Maybe you have acid reflux, which is a common problem. Or maybe you have persistent ear pain, ear clogging, or ringing in the ears, but have been told you don't have ear infections. Perhaps it's because you grind your teeth at night. Sometimes the symptoms don't seem to be connected to an underlying problem. Sometimes the answer to a nagging symptom that doesn't go away or respond to treatments can be found by having your doctor give you the time to explain exactly what's going on in order to discover the root of the problem. This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. I believe in taking the time to perform a thorough examination, discuss the findings, and answer your questions, because I believe that our patients are empowered when they're given all the treatment options. It's simple. When you understand the problem, you get to decide which treatment option works best for you.
Can you hear me okay?
It's all about the power of choice, because Peachtree ENT Center is where patient care counts. For more information or to make an appointment, go to www.peachtreeentcenter.com. That's peachtreeentcenter.com. peachtreeentcenter.com.
Okay, yeah. Okay, great. I'll do it right now.
This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. Healthcare reform is confusing,
Senator,
but one thing has become obvious, whether it's finding an affordable insurance plan, keeping your doctor, or being able to afford needed prescriptions, navigating the healthcare system has become a challenge. With the loss of the Obamacare mandate, those needing help can now choose an affordable alternative. By joining Liberty HealthShare, you'll become part of a community of health-conscious Americans all over the country who want to control their own healthcare costs and choices. Liberty HealthShare is not insurance. It's an association of self-pay patients who unite with like-minded people to share their medical needs. Neighbor helping neighbor. Medical, surgical, and some alternative holistic treatments are covered without restrictive doctor and hospital panels. Plans start as low as $107 a month for an individual and $345 a month for a family. Healthcare without the hassle. What a simple concept. Learn more now by going to libertyoncall.org or call 1-800-714-6993. This is Dr. Elena George. Join me Wednesday mornings from 9 to 10 a.m. for Medicine on Call, a show dedicated to exploring the medical, social, and political aspects of our healthcare system in order to find solutions.
And Murph.
This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. Healthcare reform is confusing, but one thing has become obvious, whether it's finding an affordable insurance plan, keeping your doctor, or being able to afford needed prescriptions. Navigating the healthcare system has become a challenge. With the loss of the Obamacare mandate, those needing help can now choose an affordable alternative. By joining Liberty HealthShare, you'll become part of a community of health-conscious Americans all over the country who want to control their own healthcare costs and choices. Liberty HealthShare is not insurance. It's an association of self-pay patients who unite with like-minded people to share their medical needs. Neighbor helping neighbor. Medical, surgical, and some alternative holistic treatments are covered without restrictive doctor and hospital panels. Plans start as low as $107 a month for an individual and $345 a month for a family. Healthcare without the hassle. What a simple concept. Learn more now by going to libertyoncall.org or call 1-800-714-6993. This is Dr. George. Join me Wednesday mornings at 9 o'clock for Medicine on Call. On Medicine on Call, we talk about more than medicine. It's about how to take control of your mind, body, and spirit.
I would think Dr. George should be walking in the door momentarily.
Do you have a problem with the feeling of something stuck in your throat, throat tightness, bad breath, a chronic cough, or frequent throat clearing? Maybe you have acid reflux, which is a common problem. Or maybe you have persistent ear pain, ear clogging, or ringing in the ears, but have been told you don't have ear infections. Perhaps it's because you grind your teeth at night. Sometimes the symptoms don't seem to be connected to an underlying problem.
Oh, okay.
Sometimes the
Well, here
answer
she
to a
is,
nagging
so,
symptom that doesn't
I'll
go
get
away
off and let
or
her get
respond to
on.
treatments can be found by having your doctor give you the time to explain exactly what's going on in order to discover the root of the problem. This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. I believe in taking the time to perform a thorough examination, discuss the findings, and answer your questions, because I believe that our patients are empowered when they're given all the treatment options. It's simple. When you understand the problem, you get to decide which treatment option works best for you. It's all about the power of choice, because Peachtree ENT Center is where patient care counts. For more information or to make an appointment, go to www.peachtreeentcenter.com. That's peachtreeentcenter.com. peachtreeentcenter.com.
Good morning. Welcome to Medicine on Call. Today I have a really important show and a very special guest joining me. State Senator Tom Davis from South Carolina is joining me today to talk about new legislation that's passed in South Carolina, which I think, after reading it, I'm actually kind of intrigued by it. Senator Davis, thank you so much for joining me.
Good morning. Great to be with you, Dr. George.
I know you have tons of things that you could be doing, so it's really an honor and a pleasure to talk with you for the next few minutes. Tell us a little bit about your legislation and yourself first. I mean, how long have you been a state senator?
Well, for myself, I'm an attorney. I practiced law in Beaufort, South Carolina for 33 years. Mm-hmm. And for your listeners, Beaufort County is where Hilton Head is located. So we're in the bottom southeastern corner of South Carolina. And starting in 2002, I got involved in politics. I helped my old college friend Mark Sanford run for governor. I moved into his basement and took a leave of absence from my law practice and ran his campaign, and he got elected governor. And so he went up to Columbia, and I found it hard to go back to my law practice when he was up there trying to accomplish some of the things that we had talked about during the campaign. So I took another leave of absence from my law practice and eventually became Governor Sanford's chief of staff. And then in 2008, I decided to run for public office myself and ran for state senate. And I have been the state senator for Beaufort County for the past 10 years. I still have my law practice. We're in session 5 months out of the year, so the remainder of the year I practice law. And I'm married to my wife, Reed, for 33 years. We have 3 daughters, and life is pretty good right now. And happy that we got this particular bill passed, Dr. George. And what it does is it expands access to health care here in South Carolina by allowing advanced nurse practitioners to provide the health care services that they're trained to provide. We have very parochial laws, or we did have very parochial laws in South Carolina before my legislation passed, that severely restricted the sort of things that nurse practitioners could do. Primary among it, they could not practice outside of a 45-mile radius of where a supervising physician was. That's been in South Carolina law for decades, and most physicians are located in urban areas. So if you do the radius technique there, you find out that nurse practitioners are actually legally unable to render medical care or provide healthcare services to rural areas. And so this particular bill strikes down those barriers and allows nurse practitioners to provide healthcare services, particularly in rural areas.
Well, when you say outside of a 45-mile radius, does that mean that they're totally autonomous, or there's still practice agreements in place? Yeah, no, they're not autonomous, and that's one of the features of this particular bill is it allows physicians and advanced nurse practitioners, and it's important to understand what we're talking about here are nurses that have 4 years undergraduate degree, at least a master's in clinical experience before they get that designation. But advanced nurse practitioners under my legislation can enter into written practice agreements with physicians so that physicians can determine, the range of services and scope of services that they're comfortable having the advanced nurse practitioner provide. Because, certain nurse practitioners, may have more experience or may be more qualified than others, and there may be a confidence level on the part of physicians. And so this legislation allows nurse practitioners and physicians to independently negotiate those practice agreements to define those scope of services. Well, for my listeners who may not understand how the relationship that you just described between, like a service agreement, basically.
Right.
The doctor has the malpractice. Am I correct? And the nurse.
Yeah, and in most cases, what I found out, Dr. George, is that nurse practitioners also carry malpractice insurance. So it's not a case of it only being the physician that has the coverage in the event there's something wrong. But you're correct. I mean, in the relationship that we're envisioning with this legislation, there'd be a team. There'd be a nurse practitioner and a physician pursuant to a written practice agreement. Both would have malpractice insurance, and the scope of what the nurse was able to provide would be defined in that written agreement. But independent of that, what we also did is in regard to certain other matters, even if it isn't in a written practice agreement, we expanded the scope of things that nurse practitioners can do on their own. Now, they're not going to cover things that we expect physicians to handle, but there are a range of things that nurse practitioners can do, and so we expand what they're authorized to do to be in accordance with what they are taught now in school and when getting a master's degree, and updating our code to reflect that today's advanced nurse practitioners have a wide range of abilities that is materially different from decades ago when the law was first passed.
Well, actually, I have two questions. One is, going back to the initial premise, who has the liability when a nurse is taking care of a patient not hundreds, but several miles away from a doctor, and there's a bad outcome? Who's liable for that?
There'd be joint and several liability there. I mean, there'd be liability, obviously, to the nurse practitioner for providing the immediate care, but then on an agency basis, on a principal-agent relationship basis, there would be imputed liability to the physician as well. So, in terms of, if there's a bad outcome or if a patient is harmed, there would be two responsible parties. There'd be the advanced nurse practitioner that rendered the direct care, and then on an agency basis, there would be imputed liability to the supervising physician.
Well, let me play devil's advocate for a quick second.
Mm-hmm.
If the nurse is in consultation with the doctor makes a recommendation, the nurse doesn't necessarily follow through with it, and so they're not on the same page.
Right.
How does a doctor protect themselves from
Well,
that?
yeah, it's on a case-by-case basis. Obviously, what a doctor has to do in a tort context, when there's an allegation of medical malpractice,
Mm-hmm.
you have to demonstrate that the doctor did not act within the scope of care, did not act in a reasonable way. And so if you have a situation where a physician, provided clear guidance and instructions, and the nurse practitioner failed to follow them, that would be, my understanding of the law, that would insulate the doctor from vicarious liability, because the doctor would have exercised reasonable care. But really, it's fact dependent. It would depend upon the facts of the case, whether or not the doctor was in regular contact with the nurse practitioner, whether clear instructions were given. I mean, those would all be fact-dependent issues. But but your point is well taken. I think that doctors and medical physicians can still insulate themselves from liability for adopting best practices in regard to working with nurse practitioners.
Well, another thing, I know we're going to take a break in a couple of minutes, but before, I just want to frame the next question about training. I understand that there's been a difference in the education of the nursing profession over the last several years, but it's not quite the same type of training that a physician gets.
Oh, no doubt.
Right,
I mean, there's always going to be a disparity in the level of expertise, and I would be the first to concede that physicians and medical doctors have much more training and have a much broader range of abilities than nurse practitioners do. There's no question about that.
Well, can you clarify what is the scope of practice for a nurse? What are the things that have been expanded under the new law that they're now able to do? Because I'm still a little fuzzy on that.
Sure. The law itself goes ahead and defines the range of things that they're allowed to do, and I'll just go ahead and read from that if that's helpful. If I can just list the things that nurse practitioners are permitted to do. independent of there being a practice agreement. But the main thing is that, if they want to practice medicine or if they want to go ahead and provide healthcare services, they basically have to be tied back to that written practice agreement. Now, there are certain non-medical things that nurse practitioners are allowed to do, such as certifying or recommending somebody for physical therapy. And there's a definitional section in the bill itself that defines, what are the things, if you get an advanced nurse practitioning degree, what are the things that you are trained to do, and it lists those particular things.
Mm-hmm. Like refer people for hospice and for physical therapy. Yeah, those are things that I've read in the law itself.
Right, and again, I mean, I think really the thing that's most important about this agreement is this bill, is it gives flexibility to the medical doctor or the physician and the nurse practitioner to, in a written agreement, specifically define the scope of things that nurse practitioners can do under the auspices of that supervising physician. And it's like in my law practice, I have a paralegal who I've worked with for 33 years. Mm-hmm. She probably knows more about real estate than I do, and I have a great degree of comfort in regard to how she handles things if clients come in, even if it is under my direct supervision. By contrast, if there's somebody that's coming right out of school or they have a paralegal degree but they don't have any practical experience, I'm going to be very wary and very hands-on in regard to what that paralegal can do. So what the law contemplates and what it allows is for a physician, if there is a long-term working relationship with a nurse practitioner, and if that nurse practitioner has demonstrated over time a great degree of expertise, it allows those two individuals on a contract basis to define the scope. So, rather than trying to hammer into a one-size-fits-all, these are a list of things that nurse practitioners can do, it makes it more flexible and dependent upon what the supervising physician is comfortable with.
Well, thank you for clarifying that. On that note, let's take a break. You're listening to Medicine on Call.
This is Dr. Elena George from Medicine on Call. When I wrote the book Big Medicine, I wanted readers to learn both how the healthcare system works and how to navigate the system to make it work for them. A supplemental policy from AFLAC is a little-known but effective strategy to help cover costs of routine medical and dental care and catastrophic care such as cancer, kidney disease, heart attacks, and stroke. Imagine buying a policy that will pay you if you are diagnosed with a catastrophic medical condition or you need emergency care, no questions asked. Whether you're a small business owner who wants to cover your employees or you have a high deductible plan, buying supplemental policy provides coverage you can actually count on to be there when you need it. It also covers preventative care such as mammograms. Imagine being paid to stay healthy. It's a no-brainer. Learn more by texting PAID to be healthy to 36260 or go to www.aflac.com/Stephen_money.
This is Lawyer Liz. Join me each week as we discuss drones, the Internet of Things, and all the technology in between. It's Buzz Off with Lawyer Liz, Wednesdays at 2.
This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. Healthcare reform is confusing, but one thing has become obvious. Whether it's finding an affordable insurance plan, keeping your doctor, or being able to afford needed prescriptions, navigating the healthcare system has become a challenge. With the loss of the Obamacare mandate, those needing help can now choose an affordable alternative. By joining Liberty HealthShare, you'll become part of a community of health-conscious Americans all over the country who want to control their own healthcare costs and choices. Liberty HealthShare is not insurance. It's an association of self-pay patients who unite with like-minded people to share their medical needs, neighbor helping neighbor. Medical, surgical, and some alternative holistic treatments are covered without restrictive doctor and hospital panels. Plans start as low as $107 a month for an individual and $345 a month for a family. Healthcare without the hassle. What a simple concept. Learn more now by going to libertyoncall.org or call 1-800-714-6993.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to Medicine on Call. We're speaking with State Senator Tom Davis of South Carolina, co-author of a bill S-345, which expands the scope of practice for nurse practitioners. And before the break, Senator, we were talking about the fact that there are the doctors and nurses together collegially decide what services the nurse is going to offer. I just want to clarify, in terms of the bill,
mm-hmm.
can any nurse practice without such an agreement in place?
What can they do without such an agreement in place? Is that the question, Dr. George?
Can they practice without such an agreement in place? So
there
is no
things.
doctor.
I mean, for instance, the bill allows nurse practitioners, independent of that written agreement,
mm-hmm.
To provide non-controlled prescription drugs. They can refer a patient to physical therapy. They can pronounce death and sign death certificates. They can issue an order for a patient to receive hospice care. They can certify that an individual is handicapped. I mean, those are all things that they can do independent of the authorization that's in the written practice agreement. And that's why I say, really the linchpin of this bill is the written practice agreement portion of it, in that's really on a case-by-case basis and dependent upon, the confidence that a physician has and the expertise that the nurse practitioner has. It really gives them a chance to fashion a way of providing health care that I think is really going to serve South Carolinians well. And it's important to understand, Dr. George, where we are here in South Carolina right now.
Mm-hmm.
We rank 44th in overall health, according to United Health Foundation's health report, and that translates to an F. And parts or all of the 46 counties in South Carolina are officially designated as medically underserved. We have 8 counties without any OBGYN physicians. We have 19 counties that have 10 or fewer family physicians, 7 counties that have less than 5, and we actually have 1 county that doesn't have a primary care physician at all. I mean, so what we're talking about here is not letting the perfect be the enemy of the good. I mean, obviously, in the best of all worlds, there would be medical doctors and physicians located throughout South Carolina, even in rural areas, and everybody would have immediate access to them. But that isn't the reality on the ground here in South Carolina. We only have 3,500, primary care physicians in the state. And with the 3,600 nurse practitioners we have, if you go ahead and start to unleash some of the potential there, if you allow them to provide the level of care that they're trained to provide, you can really effectively serve some areas that are right now going without health care services at all. So, I mean, that's really the objective here. And there's always going to be things that a physician has to do, and it certainly is always the choice of somebody to have a physician render the care as opposed to a nurse practitioner. But at its heart, too, part of what this legislation says is you as the consumer, you as the individual, when you have a problem, when you have a health care need, I mean, this allows you to determine the level of need or level of access and care that you want to secure. So there's a liberty component to this as well.
Well, I noticed, and correct me if I'm wrong, but there's a clause in the bill that states that if a nurse is not, or I should say, whoever's, I'm going to try to put this in a nice PC way, but you can't say that you're a doctor and you're not, and that would be grounds for some sort of punitive.
Absolutely. I mean, there's a consumer protection component to this, and one thing you absolutely do not want, and the legislation expressly prohibits, nurse practitioners, whether they're advanced or regardless of the degree they might hold, they can't hold themselves out as being a physician. I mean, that's absolutely clear. And I don't want to try to make the argument, and sometimes it devolves into that, our nurse practitioners as qualified as physicians are. And I think we can just stipulate that medical doctors have far more training, and they have a far broader range of expertise. But the fact of the matter is, in a large number of cases, a lot of the emergent needs of people, especially in regard to preventative health care and this routine health care, a lot of times that is something that can be handled very competently and relatively less expensively by a nurse practitioner. And in a free society where individuals are free to make their own choices, as long as you don't have people misrepresenting themselves, as long as the consumer knows exactly the level of care that they're getting, they ought to be free to choose that level of care.
Oh, I agree with you. But I think part of our problem in our society is that it's not clear, and that there's a lot of misrepresentation, and it's cloudy as to what the difference. Yeah, and I think,
to the degree that that's the case, and you're right, we need to be very clear that individuals are not authorized or do not, in fact, represent themselves to be something that they're not. And This law provides that is a violation of the code. There would be civil liability for any nurse practitioner that held themselves out to be a medical professional. I mean, so that's really the best you can do in society, is to go ahead and provide liability for bad acts. And, in the instances where people go ahead and exceed their scope of authority, they would be subject to liability to that patient.
Yeah, well, that's good news, because, at least it's not a Wild West that way.
That's right.
But have you thought about the other side of the coin here? The medical education in our country has been damaged. There's the Balanced Budget Act of 1997, which limited the number of residency spots throughout the country. So are you aware that there are thousands of doctors who've graduated from medical school but cannot get a residency and therefore cannot practice medicine? And that whole cohort would be able and willing to go into any state, into any rural area, and actually provide services.
You make an excellent point, Dr. George, and I think in terms of addressing our healthcare issues and in the country at large, we have focused in on the insurance aspect of it. We have focused in on providing individuals with coverage, quote unquote. And that's what the Affordable Care Act was all about. But what we really haven't done is focused on the supply side of the equation. We haven't broken down the barriers to individuals who want to provide services, and you put your finger on one of them. And I think that any approach to addressing healthcare in our country and to improving access and to driving down prices, quite frankly, is to remove those barriers to providers, to individuals who are trained and ready, willing, and able to provide that healthcare. I think it's a far better public policy to focus on the supply side of the equation, to actually get more individuals out there, whether they be physicians or physician's assistants or nurse practitioners. Get them out there and break down the barriers, because I think that's the most effective way to address access and cost.
Well, I tend to disagree with you on that one. When I've seen, and I can tell personally from experience of having patients who have seen nurse practitioners, gone to urgent care, less trained individuals, there's a lot of misdiagnoses that go on. I just drained a tonsil abscess yesterday from a patient who went to an urgent care for over a week, treated with the same antibiotic, and then when the culture was negative on a steroid, not knowing that just because your culture is negative, it could be a false negative. So now you have injected more costs into a system, more morbidity into a system because of lack of knowledge. We're not all the same, and I think that one statement actually is not, it does a disservice to the patient. I'm seeing the front line. I'm sure you've spoken with doctors about the same problems. We're all part of a healthcare team. That's not a question. The question is what should be the scope of practice? What should be where boundaries are set? Just because you can doesn't mean you should. And there's been this mindset that the mid-level providers are cheaper than physicians. It's not true, because when you start talking about tests ordered, about diagnoses missed, about medications that shouldn't be prescribed, for example, it ends up costing the system more. And we're seeing now the hospitals are actually changing their workforce. In Texas, they've fired a whole group of pediatricians, and they're replacing them with nurse practitioners. It's because it's all about cost on the corporate setting. And this is kind of a system that's geared to push hospitals, urgent cares, other healthcare providing services to use the mid-levels as cheaper labor.
I guess I don't necessarily think we're saying different things. But I think you have to understand that in South Carolina, and I'm not sure how it is where your practice, Dr. George, but in South Carolina, again, we have many counties that have a severe lack of physicians. And you point out that a lot of physicians are prohibited or barred from providing services because of regulations. But the fact of the matter is, in South Carolina right now, we have some counties with no OBGYN physicians, 8 of them. We have one county with no primary care physician. We had a law that actually said that if you're a nurse practitioner, you couldn't provide care 45 miles outside of where a doctor was, even though telemedicine was available. What this legislation does is it allows nurse practitioners to avail themselves of telemedicine techniques. It allows physicians and nurse practitioners now to have that relationship and to use telemedicine and to break down those radius requirements. So I don't disagree with you. I mean, there's always going to be instances where a medical doctor has to be the one that renders the care. And I think you make a good point that we have to guard against, having the mean descend, and we just simply move away from a system where physicians are involved and move solely toward lower-cost providers. That's not the objective here at all. The objective here is to allow individuals who are trained to provide a certain range of medical services, as nurse practitioners are, with the requirement that they have a master's degree, to allow them to do the things that they are trained to do, and nothing more than that, unless the physician and the relationship of the nurse practitioner and the written agreement says otherwise. So I don't think we're saying different things, but you make a good point that there are always going to be abuses, there are always going to be bad outcomes, and we have to go ahead and be aware that that takes place. And if there has to be a tweak to the law, or if there has to be an amendment or a codicil to guard against that, I'm open to having that done.
I think that's a really good point. Let's take a small break and come back. You're
Sure.
listening to Medicine on Call.
Do you have a problem with the feeling of something stuck in your throat, throat tightness, bad breath, a chronic cough, or frequent throat clearing? Maybe you have acid reflux, which is a common problem. Or maybe you have persistent ear pain, ear clogging, or ringing in the ears, but have been told you don't have ear infections. Perhaps it's because you grind your teeth at night. Sometimes the symptoms don't seem to be connected to an underlying problem. Sometimes the answer to a nagging symptom that doesn't go away or respond to treatments can be found by having your doctor give you the time to explain exactly what's going on in order to discover the root of the problem. This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. I believe in taking the time to perform a thorough examination, discuss the findings, and answer your questions, because I believe that our patients are empowered when they're given all the treatment options. It's simple. When you understand the problem, you get to decide which treatment option works best for you. It's all about the power of choice, because Peachtree ENT Center is where patient care counts. For more information or to make an appointment, go to www.peachtreeentcenter.com. That's peachtreeentcenter.com. peachtreeentcenter.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to Medicine on Call. We're speaking with State Senator Davis from South Carolina, who's let me ask you, Senator, is the bill now a law? Has it been signed by the governor, or is it?
It has.
Okay.
It was signed by the governor a few days ago.
Okay.
It takes effect, I believe it's July 1, which is the beginning of the new fiscal year in South Carolina. So you've got a little bit of lead time for the industry to kind of adapt or adjust to what the new rules and regulations are going to be in regard to what nurse practitioners can do. But yes, Governor McMaster signed it into law, and it will take effect at the beginning of our fiscal year on July 1.
Well, I've been looking, there's a lot of information out there from various sources, but one struck me that there's an argument that you mentioned before the break that there are counties that aren't served by anybody, and that nurse practitioners would step into the breach. But when you look at all of the states that have given nurse practitioners more leeway, more latitude, they still congregate in the same areas that physicians are. So they're not going out to rural areas. They're not the only game in town, and that doesn't seem to make a change in the status quo.
Well, that's why, and you're right, has been the dynamic elsewhere, and that's why we specifically inserted into this particular legislation that advanced nurse practitioners must serve in rural or underserved areas, and underserved areas are defined in the bill as being areas where you've got a certain percentage of individuals who are on public assistance, or a certain number of physicians aren't in that county. So we expressly state in this legislation that advanced nurse practitioners must, and that's a requirement, provide services in those underserved rural areas. Because you're right, I mean, it's natural economics for individuals to gravitate and to be into areas when there's a more readily accessible pool of customers, right? So one of the things that we wanted to do with this bill, and one of the ways that I really promoted it and explained it and championed it in the state Senate, was that it was going to be a way to address the shortage of healthcare services in our state's rural areas. And so that express provision in the legislation was something that was very important to me.
Well, let me also expand this and play a little bit of devil's advocate.
Okay.
The people in the rural areas generally are the least served medically. They have the most complicated medical conditions because they've gone on for in some instances, years without somebody being able to address them.
Right.
You're putting a workforce technically into an environment where the medical problems are complicated and complex. Does that give you pause?
No, but remember, we're not putting them in there alone. We're not putting them in there without there being a supervising physician. There's still the responsibility that each nurse practitioner has to have that physician with whom he or she works. There has to be that written agreement that specifies what that nurse can do. It requires the physician, even in cases where the nurse practitioner is rendering that care, it requires that physician to be there in a collaborative role. So it's not a situation where we're simply saying to nurse practitioners, okay, go out into rural areas and do whatever you can without any assistance. I mean, it all ties back and it all, plays into this notion of collaborative working between physicians and nurse practitioners. And let me be very clear, this is not an independent practice bill. This is not a bill that allows nurse practitioners to hang their own shingle out there and provide medical services to people, whether it's in rural or urban areas, without the collaborative participation of a medical doctor. I mean, so it's very clear to understand. I know that some areas do have independent practice statutes. They do allow nurse practitioners to hang out their own shingle. That's not what this bill does, though, and intentionally so. It does not do that. It requires that collaborative approach. And the thinking here is, if you can have a strong collaborative team, if you can have a medical doctor and a nurse practitioner, advanced nurse practitioner, with a very specific written agreement defining what that nurse practitioner can do, that is a very effective way of providing healthcare services into underserved rural areas.
Well, I see where you're going with it, but in real time, on the front line, that's not exactly what goes on. So you have a doctor miles away from a nurse by telemedicine. Is not quite the same thing as being next door to the nurse practitioner, having a consultation outside the patient's door, the doctor going in and actually laying hands on the patient and making an assessment.
No doubt. I mean, there's nothing that can substitute for a doctor and a patient being in the same room and making that diagnosis. But what I'd point out, Dr. George, is, I mean, we got to be careful not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good here. And again, we're not talking about a situation where we've got medical doctors or physicians in rural areas that can lay hands on and have that immediate relationship with patients. And so I take your point. I mean, it's never going to substitute and never be as good as a situation where a person can actually be in a doctor's office and have that one-on-one immediate attention. But again, what we're dealing with here in South Carolina is a crisis situation in rural areas that are completely underserved. And we have to be careful not to let the perfect be the enemy of the good in this particular case.
I totally understand your heart is in the right place on this. I do, and I appreciate that. But there's even studies now that have come out from, an ER, the Emergency Physicians Monthly, put out a study about doctors and their interaction with mid-levels. And there's a majority of doctors who don't interact with the mid-levels, right? They say they do, but they really don't. So there's this perception that there's oversight, but there's not as much oversight as you might think.
Yeah, and that came up during the subcommittee process, that, physicians will simply sign up and say, yes, they're supervising nurse practitioners and collect a monthly fee for doing that, but then in reality don't in fact provide that supervising, and that's a great point. And what we tried to do with this legislation, again, to guard against that, was to require these written practice agreements, to expressly require that there be regular communication between doctors and nurse practitioners, so that it wasn't something just in form and not reality. And I think that, the points you're making are well taken. And any time you change public policy and any time you change the way you go about doing business, it's always important to look at what actually happens as a result. What's happening on the ground? Are there abuses? Are people getting good access to health care? And I think that to the extent that there are shortcomings or to the extent there are abuses, we need to address that in subsequent legislation. So this isn't sort of like, okay, we're going to go ahead and hand down these tablets from on high, and this is the way it's going to be for all time. Any time in public policy and legislation when you're changing the established way of doing things in a certain way, you've got to look at what the actual consequences are and then be ready to come back as a legislator, and if you've made a mistake, to frankly admit it and take steps to correct it.
Well, that's good to know, because the trend now is replacement of physicians in the hospital setting. Whole emergency rooms are now being run by nurse practitioners and physician assistants. I can tell you I'm an independent doctor practicing here in Georgia, and people go into the ER now, they're not getting treated, they're getting a referral to go to a private doctor for treatment. That is not providing care. That's costing the patient a lot more money than they should have to pay, and they're taking longer to get care. I mean, so something I would think, hopefully, needs to be put in place that the actual, the place of service is staffed accordingly. We've had whole ERs at this point that don't have ear, nose, and throat coverage, neurology, OBGYN. How do they call themselves ERs and people roll up with those problems and they have to be shipped elsewhere? These are things to me that we really do need to start addressing, because
you make some excellent points, and quite frankly, I wasn't aware on the supply side of the equation, because again, as a free market person, I'm always looking at addressing things from a supply and demand standpoint, and frankly, I wasn't aware until talking to you just now, Dr. George, that there are these impediments to more physicians coming into the healthcare sector. And so I think what I'm hearing you say, and I'm in complete agreement, that if there are barriers or if there are restrictions or things that are preventing, doctors and physicians from actually coming in and being able to provide these cares, we need to break down those barriers as well. I mean, this isn't a silver bullet. I mean, and nothing with healthcare is going to be solved with one single initiative. So all these things need to be done. And so you make some excellent points. I mean, in regard to if there are, in fact, situations where medical doctors aren't available, or in settings where you would expect them to be available, they in fact are not, we need to figure out why that's the case and then break down those barriers to make sure that situation doesn't occur.
I totally agree with you. I mean, the Affordable Care Act is a complete, example of unintended consequences.
Right.
When you read that law, they spend a lot of money on educating mid-levels, on medical assistants, on the allied healthcare professionals. Absolutely nothing was spent on increasing the number of residency spots for doctors.
Well, I think you put your finger on a major public policy defect in that particular legislation, and I'm in complete agreement that it needs to be addressed as well.
I know. My thing is, we don't have to recreate the wheel, right? We have a pool of physicians, doctors, graduated from medical school, passed their training, their postgraduate exams, but because they can't get a one-year residency, they're out there doing other things.
Right.
Though you could find OBGYNs to go into your rural areas. Trust me, you would have doctors flooding South Carolina, ready and willing and able to help you, and actually act like mentors or work with physician agreements with the nurse practitioner, so they're not so far away from doctors.
Have any states, and I guess I'm not supposed to be the one asking questions, but I'm wondering if any states have initiatives, to try to break down that difficulty to get residencies in order to get a greater supply of physicians, and I'll look into what state level public policies can be advanced to address that problem, because you're drawing attention to something that is of great concern, and now that I'm thinking about it, we need to go ahead and make sure not only that nurse practitioners and physicians assistants are allowed to provide the care they're trained to provide, we need to break down some of these barriers or some of these impediments to physicians being able to serve areas as well.
I think it all works together, frankly.
It does.
If you have more doctors to be available to nurse practitioners and physician assistants, they wouldn't be out there on a limb. I've actually spoken with nurses, registered nurses. When we started changing the workforce, the face of the workforce, a lot of my friends who practiced for 20, 30 years, that were nurses in the ICU, etc., left, stopped nursing because they felt that they were being forced to do things they didn't feel comfortable with.
Right.
Putting in lines, running ICUs without a physician there to oversee. That's not fair to them either. Even
Absolutely.
Though the mindset is nurses are equal to doctors, I think that's what the general push is being made.
Yeah, and I can understand how, sometimes large corporations or hospitals or medical companies are just focused on the bottom line and interested in providing, care at the lowest, cost level so that they can maximize profits. I agree with you. I think if that dynamic is holding sway And if you have a situation where nurse practitioners are being forced into areas that, quite frankly, they aren't trained and not comfortable, I think you're going to find the advanced nurse practitioner community pushing back, because that is not what they want either. I mean, all that they want is, to the extent they were trained to do something, if they have the ability to do something, they want the ability to develop a relationship with the doctor that allows them to do that. I think they would be equally uncomfortable with a situation where market forces are driving them to actual providing services that they weren't qualified to provide. So I'll be watching out for that. I quite frankly wasn't aware that that was such a prevalent problem, but you make a great point in that regard, Dr. George.
Oh man, it's a huge problem, and I've done contract work, medical work throughout the country, and one of the things I'm struck by when I'm covering an emergency room, whether that's in Maine or New Mexico, I've been around a lot of places, so I've seen a lot of delivery systems. These folks are coming from 100 miles away for ENT services because their ER doesn't have one, or no neuro. I mean, these are airway emergency, right? Emergency tracheostomy. You cannot be in a situation where there's not enough help to get things done because patients die.
No question. No question. I mean, it's an all-of-the-above strategy, right? I mean, it's not just about empowering nurse practitioners to do what they're trained to do. It's also about allowing doctors to do what they're trained to do and removing the impediments to them being able to do so. And so I think we're saying the same things, and, it's important in any legislation, and I think as policymakers sometimes we tend to pass a law, then sit back, and be satisfied and say, okay, well, we fixed that problem. That's not the case with good public policy. You're constantly looking at, okay, what was the effect of what we passed? Did it accomplish the objective that we intended? Is there better access to health care? Do we have nurse practitioners providing care that's within the scope of what they're able to do? Are there abuses? And then to come back and to make changes if appropriate. So this is an ongoing process. And again, I would say this, that this particular bill, the one that was signed into law here in South Carolina, in the spectrum of things, when you're looking at this particular issue, it's a fairly conservative bill. It does not establish independent practice. It emphasizes the written agreement between a physician and a nurse practitioner. It is very clear that nurse practitioners aren't supposed to provide acts that medical doctors are to provide. So it was our attempt to begin the process of allowing nurse practitioners to do more things, but I'll keep an eye out for those unintended consequences that you mentioned, Dr. George.
Thank you so much. On that note, let's take a break. You're listening to Medicine on Call.
This is Dr. Elena George from Medicine on Call. When I wrote my book, Big Medicine, I wanted readers to learn both how the healthcare system works and how to navigate the system to make it work for them. A supplemental policy from AFLAC is a little-known but effective strategy to help cover costs of routine medical and dental care and catastrophic care such as cancer, kidney disease, heart attacks, and stroke. Imagine buying a policy that will pay you if you are diagnosed with a catastrophic medical condition or you need emergency care, no questions asked. Whether you're a small business owner who wants to cover your employees or you have a high deductible plan, buying supplemental policy provides coverage you can actually count on to be there when you need it. It also covers preventative care such as mammograms. Imagine being paid to stay healthy. It's a no-brainer. Learn more by texting Paid to Be Healthy to 36260 or go to www.aflac.com/Stephen_money.
This is Lawyer Liz. Join me each week as we discuss drones, the Internet of Things, and all the technology in between. It's Buzz Off with Lawyer Liz, Wednesdays at 2.
Do you have a problem with the feeling of something stuck in your throat, throat tightness, bad breath, a chronic cough, or frequent throat clearing? Maybe you have acid reflux, which is a common problem. Or maybe you have persistent ear pain, ear clogging, or ringing in the ears, but have been told you don't have ear infections. Perhaps it's because you grind your teeth at night. Sometimes the symptoms don't seem to be connected to an underlying problem. Sometimes the answer to a nagging symptom that doesn't go away or respond to treatments can be found by having your doctor give you the time to explain exactly what's going on in order to discover the root of the problem. This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. I believe in taking the time to perform a thorough examination, discuss the findings, and answer your questions, because I believe that our patients are empowered when they're given all the treatment options. It's simple. When you understand the problem, you get to decide which treatment option works best for you. It's all about the power of choice. because Peachtree ENT Center is where patient care counts. For more information or to make an appointment, go to www.peachtreeentcenter.com. That's peachtreeentcenter.com. peachtreeentcenter.com.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank you for listening.
Welcome back to Medicine on Call. Today we're talking about the law now in effect in South Carolina, S345, co-authored by Senator Tom Davis. And Senator, I really just want to thank you so much for your willingness to listen and to learn. I mean, this is something that's involved that affects patients, and patients should be the focal point of everything. Not doctor and nurse ego, not physician assistant ego. We're deliverers of this system to patients, and it needs to work better.
And that's one of the things that I was struck by during the subcommittee process, is just how dedicated and committed medical professionals, physicians, nurse practitioners are to patients. I was truly struck by that. And again, as a policymaker, you have to listen very carefully to the people who are actually carrying things out. So I appreciate that sentiment.
Well, from an independent doc, out there on the front lines, it's one of the things that we as physicians, I don't know if you have the experience, but we're frustrated by the fact that nobody seems to listen to us,
Right.
And everybody's talking at us, and we seem to be the problem. We're the problem with the cost, we're the problem with the no access. It's all laying on the feet of the doctors, and actually, we're not. And we want to.
And my experience in this process was not that at all. I mean, the South Carolina Medical Association and the physicians, I mean, they were extremely cooperative and forthcoming in this process. And this truly was a collaborative bill. It wasn't, legislation that was passed over the objections of physicians. I mean, the physicians were at the table along with nurse practitioners, and they agreed on all of these things. So your point's well taken. You have to have input from those experts and those people that are actually in the field.
But it has to be the range of experts, not just academicians, not just doctors who are on the staff of hospitals who are getting a paycheck and are part of the corporate system,
right.
But the independent doctors who are out there who have to see patients and make it work, right? That means people who are paying cash, people who barter, people who have direct primary care practices. We are actually part of the solution.
Absolutely.
All right, so if you're trying to engage an entire health delivery system, everybody has to have a voice. And the fact that you unfortunately didn't know that there are doctors out there, thousands literally, who are dying to practice their art. They spent all this money training and they can't get a job
because of residency or a lack of residency positions. Correct. Is that correct?
Yeah, but if I'm not sure if you know how our process works. It's 4 years of medical school. You have to pass three sections of a board, part 1 and 2 and 3. But in order to license, you can pass everything. But if you don't do 1 year of residency,
right,
you cannot be licensed, period.
Right.
That means you'll never be a doctor. There should not be any doctor who's graduated in our country who can't work because of that.
I agree completely.
And I think that's probably part of the genesis of the doctor shortage and the lack of health care in rural areas. It stems from not having enough people and then needing to think outside the box, expand it, extend it. I know the genie's not going back in the bottle, but we do need to make sure that it doesn't go so far off the track of patient care that we can't get it back. If I took me six years to do ear, nose, and throat as a postgraduate training, once I leave practice, if you don't have other ENTs coming behind me, you lose a whole section of patient care that can't come back, and that cannot be filled in by mid-level providers because we train differently, right?
Understood.
So everybody has a role and a purpose, and a specialist is just as important as a primary care doctor. Primary care doctor is just as important as a mid-level provider. Everybody has to be in the soup, and I agree with you. I'm a free market person myself. Let the patient choose who they want to see. But their choice shouldn't be made for them because of absence or lack of. Then you've taken their choice away from them.
Fair point.
So, I really, what does your other colleagues think about this law?
Well, I mean, there was a lot of attention that we paid to the prescription process. I mean, as you know, right now we have an opioid crisis, and everybody's radar, is in regard to, okay, are we opening the floodgates to controlled substances being put in the hands of people for abuse? And so, a large portion of this legislation deals with what sort of prescriptive authority that nurse practitioners can have, and we were very detailed in this regard. Requiring the nurse practitioner to petition for prescriptive authority, requiring that there be a specific written agreement with a physician, allowing it to include Schedule II non-narcotic substances only if they're in the practice agreement, allowing Schedule II narcotic substances if it's in the practice agreement, but limiting the prescription not to exceed a 5-day supply. I mean, so we really went out of our way to make sure that we weren't somehow opening up the floodgates, for opioids or opium-based medicines to get into the hands of people who are going to abuse them. And so a lot of the debate and a large portion of the bill focuses on how do we control that? How do we make sure physicians are involved? How do we make sure that this particular prescriptive authority isn't abused? And again, this is an example, Dr. George, of let's see if what we did accomplishes the objective. Let's see if it goes ahead and facilitates the access to health care, but at the same time doesn't create a prescriptive opioid problem. And I think everybody is committed. All the doctors and all the nurse practitioners and people that worked on this bill are committed to looking and seeing how it works in practice and then coming back in to make changes if necessary. So I think that's the point that I would leave your listeners with is in public policy, whether it's at the federal level, state level, passing a bill is rarely, if ever, the end of the matter. You always have to see how it works in practice, and you always have to have an open mind and a willingness to make changes if necessary.
I really appreciate that. I wish the federal level would work that way.
Well, unfortunately, we tend to look at things as a zero-sum game, that certain parties win and certain parties lose. This is a case where we want everybody to win. We want the patients to win. We want there to be enough physicians to provide care. We want advanced nurse practitioners to provide the level of services that they're able to provide. We want physicians' assistants to be able to do so. But what you're saying, I think, is the same thing I'm saying. We want to make sure that the patient's interests are well served. And I think that's the approach we have to have with anything in this regard.
Well, you're speaking music to my ears because it's all about us listening to each other.
Absolutely.
Right?
I mean, this is not a situation where you've got battle lines drawn in competing camps and one side wins and one side loses. I mean, the objective here is to have the patients win. And in my experience in South Carolina here has been exactly that. I mean, the physicians, the nurse practitioners, the physician's assistants, the hospital association, I mean, everybody, I was impressed with the fact that they did have that objective in mind. It wasn't about economic turf. It wasn't about preserving an economic advantage. It was all about how can we increase the level of health care access and how can we make sure it's quality access.
Well, I think that we can agree on the fact that it has to be everybody involved. It cannot be just one-sided. And that would be, to me, the linchpin or the foundation. There's respect for each other.
Absolutely. It's a collaborative effort.
Exactly.
Everybody has their role to play in this.
There's no devaluation of anybody.
None at all.
Right? And that would make it better for the patient.
Absolutely. You and I are saying the same thing, Dr. George.
Well, let me tell you, if you ever need my help in anything or you have a question, I want to be a resource because I love what I do. I was born to be a physician, and I can speak of thousands of doctors who believe what I do, that we just want to be able to help our patients practice the Hippocratic Oath and provide a service. And we don't want things that encroach on that, interfere with that, or obstruct it.
Understood.
And if we need to be in with you guys to help craft legislation, then you have, a whole cohort of doctors who are willing and able to give you, their experience, so your frame of reference becomes larger.
Right. And this particular bill that passed is just the beginning of a larger conversation. And what you've just said is something we need to keep in mind as we move forward.
Well, I just want to thank you again for your time, and call me if you need me. I would be happy to be a resource. And anything else that comes down the pipe, I'm looking forward to having you back on.
Great. I enjoyed our conversation, Dr. George.
Thank you. Have a blessed day.
You too. Bye-bye.
And thank you for listening to Medicine on Call.
Do you have a problem with the feeling of something stuck in your throat, throat tightness, bad breath, a chronic cough, or frequent throat clearing? Maybe you have acid reflux, which is a common problem. Or maybe you have persistent ear pain, ear clogging, or ringing in the ears, but have been told you don't have ear infections. Perhaps it's because you grind your teeth at night. Sometimes the symptoms don't seem to be connected to an underlying problem. Sometimes the answer to a nagging symptom that doesn't go away or respond to treatments can be found by having your doctor give you the time to explain exactly what's going on in order to discover the root of the problem. This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. I believe in taking the time to perform a thorough examination, discuss the findings, and answer your questions, because I believe that our patients are empowered when they're given all the treatment options. It's simple. When you understand the problem, you get to decide which treatment option works best for you. It's all about the power of choice, because Peachtree ENT Center is where patient care counts. For more information or to make an appointment, go to www.peachtreeentcenter.com. That's peachtreeentcenter.com. peachtreeentcenter.com. This is Dr. George from Medicine on Call. Healthcare reform is confusing, but one thing has become obvious. Whether it's finding an affordable insurance plan, keeping your doctor, or being able to afford needed prescriptions, navigating the healthcare system has become a challenge. With the loss of the Obamacare mandate, those needing help can now choose an affordable alternative. By joining Liberty HealthShare, you'll become part of a community of health-conscious Americans all over the country who want to control their own healthcare costs and choices. Liberty HealthShare is not insurance. It's an association of self-pay patients who unite with like-minded people to share their medical needs. Neighbor helping neighbor. Medical, surgical, and some alternative holistic treatments are covered without restrictive doctor and hospital panels. Plans start as low as $107 a month for an individual and $345 a month for a family. Healthcare without the hassle. What a simple concept. Learn more now by going to libertyoncall.org or call 1-800-714-6993. Neighbor helping neighbor. Medical, surgical, and some alternative holistic treatments are covered without restrictive doctor and hospital panels. Plans start as low as $107 a month for an individual and $345 a month for a family. Healthcare without the hassle. What a simple concept. Learn more now by going to libertyoncall.org or call 1-800-714-6993.
You're listening to America's Web Radio on the AmericasBroadcastNetwork.com. Thank
Welcome. This is Detailing Addiction. I'm Dr. Susan Blank, and you're listening to America's Web Radio. Today in studio with me, I have David Donaldson and Michael Daly from the Atlanta Healing Center. Thanks for being here, guys.
Thank you. Hi, glad to be here.
Glad to have you here, and thanks to all of you for listening. Today we're going to talk about dangerous addictions that many people don't even recognize as being addictions. And unfortunately, some of them can actually even be deadly. But when we look at the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, or the DSM-5, which is the book that carries all of the diagnoses and the criteria for making diagnoses related to psychiatric disorders or the disease of addiction, when it came out with its most recent edition in 2013, the DSM-5, it added for the first time a behavioral addiction. And this behavioral addiction that was added is gambling. Now, this is a very interesting one, and it is the one that has the most documented evidence in terms of it being exactly like a chemical addiction in terms of how it affects the brain and the addiction center of the brain. So this is one that we mentioned just briefly last week in terms of sports betting when we were talking about addiction in the news, because as you may recall, the Supreme Court did allow states to determine whether or not they were going to allow betting on sports games, amateur and professional. So with this, we made note last week on last week's show that gambling was a rising problem and that many people who are authorities on this particular behavioral addiction are very concerned about this one more way in which gambling is now going to be even easier and even more tempting. But gambling is an addiction. Most people, I'm not sure, understand that very well.
That's true. I think that people think that if you gamble, if you scratch off a ticket, if you want to go visit a casino, play slots, that type of thing, if you have a compulsion to do that, that's not necessarily a gambling addiction. It's when you have that compulsion and can't let it go until you act on it. Apparently that's when it becomes an addiction. There's several questions that people can ask themselves to see if they do have a gambling problem. If you feel out of control or you have little control over your desire to continue gambling, that's one little sign. If you feel compelled until you've spent your very last dollar, that's a pretty good sign.
Pretty good sign.
When you hide your gambling from friends or family, that's another thing that kind of shows you if you have a problem. Or if you spend money that you don't have to spend for that you're spending. For example, you're spending your house payment money on gambling, or you're spending your house payment money plus your car payment on gambling to try to win back what you've lost already. That's a real sign of
a problem. And I think you mentioned a couple of things, Michael, that most people wouldn't necessarily think of in terms of gambling, and that's playing the scratch-off tickets or some other forms of betting or that don't necessarily involve going to a casino and playing blackjack or playing the slot machines.
Lottery.
That we kind of see really clearly as gambling, but I'm just really interested. I think that many people might not see the scratch-off tickets or playing the lottery or playing some of the bingo, some of the games that may not be high dollar stakes or may not even be dollar in reward. You may get another lotto ticket, or you may get a prize at the bingo parlor. So many times people don't really think of these as gambling, and yet the behavior is very much the same.
In particular, the behaviors that people begin doing to try to control it or to try to cover it up or to hide it. That last one that Michael was talking about, where you're hiding your losses from family members or keeping it all a secret. The thing that strikes me with all of the different topics that we have today is that they're all things that people don't necessarily think of as a big deal.
Right.
Because they've been either relegated to a particular part of the population or maybe a particular part of the country. And so people think of gambling as just something you do when you're on vacation, if you're on a cruise or if you go to Vegas or something, and they don't really register it as a big deal. And the estimates for gambling addiction and for the other addictions tends to be right about 3% of the people who participate in it have addiction. But I think that's because these are things that have been limited by either geography or by
local laws.
And now that a lot of those local laws are going away, I think that the percentage is going to rise up to the same percentage, that same standard 10% that we see with chemical dependency and with other addictions.
I do too, and I think to your point, often the questions aren't necessarily asked when someone comes in for addiction treatment. It's very clear they're coming in for alcohol use or because they've been using drugs. And often the questions aren't even asked of the person whether or not the behavioral addictions, some of which we're going to talk about, but specifically gambling, whether that has been a problem. And just as people might not recognize that their drug use might be problematic, they may not recognize that the way in which they gamble and play these games of chance, if you will, are also very compelling and very addictive.
Mm-hmm. It's amazing to me if you've ever gone into